I know these analytical responses seem like daunting tasks to some of y'all, but one of the things you can do to make them a little bit easier is break them down into their component parts, right? So if your requirement here is 3 separate paragraphs, well, if you think about that, 500 word minimum, which far too many of you shot for just the bare minimum. 500 is the least you should do. There's nothing that says you can't do 6, 7, 800 words. And those of y'all that spent more time and provided more evidence and more analysis and got into those 6, 7, 800 word counts ended up doing a lot better, right? So don't just give yourself 500 words and be done with it. Instead, try to really provide a good response. These analytical responses all in are worth half of your grade. So the more effort you put in here, the better that's going to reflect on your final grade. And the final paper is going to be based on a lot of the ideas you develop here. So the more time and effort you put in now, the easier that final paper, which is worth 25% of your grade, is going to be. So with this question, we've got 3 distinct tasks. Let's break it down. And that means that you can handle each one individually. You could even do it over the course of 2 or 3 days and write, 200 words a day and be good to go. First one, how did people in positions of power in Vedic civilization use some of the ideas in the 2 sources we had assigned to keep order in their society? You know from the lectures that there was a clear and logical idea of a caste system that was perpetuated in Vedic society. You had 4 different orders of people, and at the top of society were priests who were able to, according to them, interpret the words of God, gods, and offer kind of sacrifices and also potentially get insight into why the world is the way it is. And then you had warriors, leaders, who really handle the day-to-day affairs of running a civilization, whether they are kings or oligarchs. More often than not, those 2 groups of people unite and they try and scratch each other's backs to make sure that society stays the way it is. So how could we look into these 2 sources that originally are oral sources? They're passed on from person to person, priest to priest largely, and aren't written down. How could we look into those and find some things that people would use to say, oh, okay, it makes sense that we should have these castes, or it makes sense that the bottom tier of society should do all the work, or it makes sense that we shouldn't challenge where we're born, or it makes sense that kings are put here for a reason. Similarly, Ashoka is an individual who conquers, following his grandfather and father, much of India, and then sets up a bunch of laws and says, hey, if you follow these laws, we'll do well. And at the same time, he also presents himself in a very particular way to try and make himself appealing as a leader. So how could we dig into his rock edicts and see what his ruling strategy is? Once you do that, you can step back, you can take a break, and then you can get together and you can say, okay, now I know the context in which the Mahabharata and the Rig Veda were created and passed down. I know what Vedic society was like. And in some ways it's the same as Mauryan society, and in some ways it's way different. So how are those 2 ideals of ruling, ideals of keeping society stable, sorry, I've got stain on my hands, similar, and how are they different, and why is that important? And if you spend some time thinking about who would have created these, who would have been invested in maintaining the status quo, that can help you lead your response into something that is even better and more analytical.